Welcome, everybody. Good evening. My name is Patrick Cummins. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Audubon Society. Welcome to Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds. This year, all of the proceeds from the series will go towards our sanctuaries for maintaining trails, for habitat improvement work, such as replacing invasive plants with native species and restoring shrublands. Thank you. Your contribution makes a real difference. As for Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds, we have a great lineup in 2023, starting with tonight's program. As Connecticut Audubon members know, each year we publish the Connecticut State of the Birds Report. In 2021, the report was titled 3 Billion Birds Are Gone. How do we bring them back? The basis for our report was a study published a few years earlier that demonstrated that over the past 50 years, the bird populations in North America had declined by about 30%, or about 3 billion birds. In the conservation world, it was a momentous finding. It opened the eyes of scientists to the reality that bird conservation, as it was being carried out, wasn't really working and needed to be rethought. A number of institutions and national conservation organizations set to work on collaborating on a plan. Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Georgetown University, National Audubon Society, American Bird Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation, and others. It was released a few months ago as the U.S. State of the Birds Report. Corina Newsome, an associate conservation scientist at the National Wildlife Federation, was on the report's communications committee. She's with us this evening to walk us through the report and to talk about the first steps in the road to recovery for birds. Corina has a Master of Science degree from the Georgia State University. She's on the steering committee of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. You might also remember her as one of the co-organizers of the Black Birders Week in 2020. Corina, welcome to Young, Gifted, and Wild About Birds. Great pleasure to have you as the first presenter of 2023. I want to quickly add that we are recording this presentation and we'll send everyone a link to the video. Closed captioning is available if you can choose it at the bottom of your screen. Now let me turn it over to Corina.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly a pleasure. I've heard and have learned so much from Connecticut Audubon over the years and have followed you all's work. And so I'm so thrilled when you all invited me to come and speak. As was just mentioned, birds are very much central to the work that I do as an ornithologist and as a person who enjoys looking at and listening to birds in my everyday life. They're the way that I connect with my community around me and the way that I connect to the world around me, the larger ecological community of which I am a part. And in the Connecticut Audubon, I believe at the beginning, there's a quote from Peter Mera, if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, that talks about, when you publish a report that is as groundbreaking and jarring, honestly, as the 2019 report on the loss of birds that we've experienced in the past 50 years, you cannot just go back to business as usual. The status quo isn't working. And it's also alarming when you're someone who loves birds. And so I remember the day that report came out, I actually got in my car and I was in South Georgia in grad school. I drove to Tennessee. That was the closest other kind of bird fanatic, bird conservation people I had in my network. And I just thought, what can we do? It was so alarming to me to hear and to read how many birds we've lost. And so I'm grateful to have been able to contribute in any small way to helping bring birds back, or at the very least, sharing their plight with as many people as possible. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. All right, so this evening, I'm going to be speaking with you all about the State of the Birds report that was released at the end of last year, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have seen at least some communications about. And this report, of course, was following up that landmark study that was published in 2019 that shared how many birds we've lost across North America since 1970. And so as you may know, just about 3 billion birds have been lost since in the past 50 years. And this has been able to be tracked or even known because of the incredible amount of data that has been produced by not only scientists, but everyday people who just go outside and enjoy watching birds and sharing what they see. Because of the work of everyday people who love birds, we were able to even know that this was happening to our birds. And when it comes to the bird losses that we'd we've experienced those 3 billion birds, some of the numbers that you may be familiar with include our grassland birds, which experience the steepest loss of all land birds. We saw a decrease by about 720 million when it comes to grassland birds, and the eastern meadowlark being a very iconic grassland bird, 3 and 4 of those have been lost in the past 70 years. When you think about migratory birds, and there are so many migratory species of birds across North America, and 2.5 billion migratory birds were lost since 1970, including birds like the Baltimore Oriole. And then you think about some iconic species that they all provide really important ecosystem services, but our aerial insectivores provide some of the most obvious ones as they are flying around acrobatically in the air, catching insects. And unfortunately, we've lost about 160 million of those aerial insectivores since 1970. And when looking specifically at the barn swallow, 2 in 5 barn swallows are gone. And so in the State of the Birds report, we highlight the trends of various classifications, habitat classifications of birds. So we looked at arid land birds, dry land birds, eastern forest birds, sea ducks, grassland birds, right? And of most habitats, pretty much all habitats, we saw average downward slopes, average declines across all of those habitats. Again, the steepest being in the grassland birds, except in wetlands. Wetlands were the only habitats where we saw an average increase in the population of birds that inhabit those ecosystems. Now, when it comes to the birds that we've lost, the State of the Birds report highlights that there are what are called tipping point species, and there are 70 tipping point species. Now, to kind of describe what that means, so there are 90 species which have lost half of their populations in the last 50 years, which is a really alarming statistic. But unfortunately, of those 90, 70 of those are expected or projected, if nothing changes, to lose another 50% of their populations in the next 50 years, or they're at extremely small population sizes and maybe in even a more perilous state than that. And so 70 species have been categorized as tipping point species, which include birds like this hummingbird, like the Allen's hummingbird. But we see these tipping point species across ecosystems, across habitat types, from coastal and oceanic, ocean-going birds like albatross, murrelets, to our grassland birds like bobolinks. And I will just put a plug in for bobolinks. If you've not had the chance to see them, they are quite the sight to see during migration. Our sage grouse, prairie warblers. And one of the really interesting dynamics, which I'll highlight in a second, was, so when we looked at those habitats, we saw that, across habitats, there was generally an average downward, a downward slope or a decline in populations. But in wetlands, there was an average upswing in populations. But it's not for all birds that live in wetlands. That statistic, that upward trend, really is specific to waterfowl in particular and some other water birds. But birds that live, for example, in coastal marshes, salt marshes, or even freshwater marshes are seeing really steep declines. Birds like salt marsh sparrows or seaside sparrows, and some of our rails are seeing declines, even though they live in that wetland bird category. And then, of course, several Arctic and alpine tundra bird species. And so those wetland birds that saw increases, that wasn't by accident, right? So we saw downward trends in pretty much every other category but wetlands. And that was because of intentional work, intentional effort, both when it comes to finances and when it comes to policy. And some of the reasons, the main reasons why we saw this upswing in the populations of waterfowl in particular were because of bills like the Wetlands Conservation Act, or some of the partnerships with private landowners, public-private partnerships under the North American Waterfowl Management Plan that allowed for the strategic use of private lands to ensure that those lands were managed to support waterfowl populations, because there is a huge constituent base of people who love ducks in particular for hunting or for bird watching. And because people really, really cared, those resources were funneled behind that group of birds. And so that is why we saw that upswing compared to a lot of the downward trends that we saw in other species, including other birds that live in wetlands. So as I mentioned, not all wetland birds are winning. And I mentioned one particular species, the seaside sparrow, which is pictured here. That dynamic where we see waterfowl and a few other kinds of birds on the upswing and several other birds that share those ecosystems or similar ones on the downswing points to the fact that targeted efforts are needed. The reason why waterfowl in particular are winning or are on the upswing is because people cared about waterfowl and managed habitat to promote waterfowl population increase. And so that same kind of targeted approach is needed for those species that are in decline in wetlands, including our marsh sparrows and rails and other wetland birds. And so that kind of effort is still necessary, even when average population changes are on the upswing for wetland birds across the board. And so I do want to take just a moment to zero in on salt marsh species, particularly when it comes to sparrows. Sparrows are some of my very favorite birds. And I had the very distinct opportunity to study sparrows during my master's research. And so if you've never had the chance to see a salt marsh environment, this is just a really quick video showing you how expansive they can be. This is the Georgia's coastal marsh. They are, from a distance, they look pretty homogeneous, like there might not be a lot going on in there, but there is so much life bursting at the seams in salt marshes. And there are so many different kinds of birds that live in salt marshes, as we just described. And it was really eye-opening to be able to see up close some of the dynamics that are threatening their existence. And so there are some natural threats that face coastal birds, like predation, this is a video of a nest predation event for a seaside sparrow, and boom, there you have a mink, an American mink, which is a natural predator of salt marsh birds, taking an egg out of a nest. And that's a natural dynamic that has always existed. But in the context of, for example, climate change, which is an exacerbating threat for species everywhere, we're seeing coastal species like salt marsh sparrows and seaside sparrows having essentially this increased or exacerbated threats from threats that may have already existed. And as a warning, this video that I'm about to show is a little bit jarring. It's blurry. I always say the cameras that I was using out in the marsh were like Dollar General parking lot security camera quality video cameras. Okay, so not great camera quality, but what I'm going to show you here, this is a seaside sparrow nest that has 2 eggs and a chick floating on top of water. So this is a high tide event that has unfortunately overtopped the nest, and the chick that you see just hatched earlier that day. So it's only hours old. And so unfortunately, sea level rise, which is a consequence of climate change, is one of the threats that's being exacerbated for coastal marsh dwelling birds. And so flooding itself is a source of mortality, or in itself can cause the death of birds or the failure of a nest. But one thing that I found in my research is not only is flooding in itself a threat, but flooding actually comes with new aquatic predators. And so the video I'm going to show you is a fish, which is this dark line. I don't know if you can see my cursor right there in the nest, and it's actually going to eat the chick. I'm not going to show you the whole video, but you can see that fish, which accessed the nest because of flooding, now depredating that chick. And so issues like climate change are exacerbating already existing threats of predation for birds like seaside sparrows. And so when we think about the changing world that birds have to survive in, we're having to navigate a suite of novel threats, in particular when it comes to those created by climate change. And so, when we look at the dire straits that so many bird species are in, and for example, the salt marsh sparrows, the seaside sparrows, the grassland birds, right? It can be pretty bleak to see how steeply they've declined in such a rapid amount of time. But at the same time, there's so much hope, because we've seen with waterfowl, with a couple of other kind of bird groups, that when we tried and actually invested the resources and the policy to ensure that birds and the resources that they require are there, they actually respond well. Conservation works. When we target our investments and are intentional about those investments, conservation does work. And Tom, feel free to, as I'm kind of coming up on time, feel free to jump in and let me know if I'm running over. And so conservation, especially bird conservation, can work for all of us. Bird conservation not only benefits birds, it of course benefits the other species that inhabit the ecosystems they live in, but it also benefits us as another species that shares their ecosystem. So conservation, when it comes to birds, it can strengthen and does strengthen our natural infrastructure. So for example, when our wetlands are intact, it helps us to prevent drought or floods when we have the ecosystems that help to retain water in the places where we live. We can prevent some of the really intense droughts that are expected to be exacerbated with climate change. When we think about climate change, when we invest in bird conservation and making decisions about the natural world that benefit birds, it strengthens our ability to adapt to climate change. So for example, when we're managing our habitats in a way that are ensuring that we, for example, don't have a lot of fuel load in our forests, we are less susceptible to wildfires. When we have forests that are healthy and thriving, we are providing opportunities for ourselves to be protected from extreme heat. So when we're investing in bird conservation, we're also investing in ourselves. And of course, we are increasing our quality of life when birds win. And so as bird watchers, birders, people who enjoy their local birds here on this call, I'm sure you know the feeling of the stress dropping off of you, whatever that stress might be, when you go outside, when you go into a forest, even if you're just out in your front yard and a house finch lands on your feeder, right? There's a feeling of wellness that kind of comes with that experience. And there was actually a study that was done, I believe it might have also been in 2019 or 2020, that showed that there is a measurable increase in quality of life with the increase of the diversity of birds, similar to the quality of life increase that we experience when we have a pay raise, right? So we can actually measure and detect how much better we feel emotionally, how much better our wellness is when birds thrive around us. And then finally, bird conservation actually is able to be a multiplier for environmental justice. And this is actually one of my very favorite parts of the State of the Birds report. One of the unique features that wasn't in previous reports, but this phrase, multiplier for environmental justice, is very interesting to me because usually when I hear the word multiplier, it's in the context of threats, right? So oftentimes we might hear climate change is a threat multiplier, right? So like I just said, a bird that experienced predation naturally now has to also deal with flooding plus predation, a threat multiplier, right? That's true for people too. But the beautiful thing is that birds can be an environmental justice multiplier. And when I say environmental justice, I'm specifically referring to the fact that there are communities of people, both here in the United States and around the world, that carry the burden of environmental harm or environmental degradation much, much more than other communities. So Black communities, Indigenous communities, brown communities, low wealth communities typically are more exposed to environmental harms and hazards and have decreased access to environmental amenities, the ecosystem services that actually help to sustain our lives. That's environmental injustice. So environmental justice means countering those dynamics and investing in the wellness and the health and the access to environmental amenities of the communities that have borne those burdens more than anybody else. And so when we invest in bird conservation, we can multiply or increase environmental justice, access to healthy environments for Black, brown, low wealth communities and communities that have historically been neglected when it comes to conservation and environmental access. And the reason why birds are so uniquely positioned to be an environmental justice multiplier is because more than most other living things on this planet, birds connect spaces. They connect spaces at an international scale, right? So birds that spend part of the year in the super tippy top of the north will fly down to the tip of Argentina in the winter. Good thinking. So they connect landscapes like across hemispheres, but they also connect communities, right? So I, for example, live in the city of Atlanta, and birds that utilize some of our really beautiful, large, lush state parks are also utilizing very tiny city parks where people are barbecuing and have playgrounds, right? And are utilizing those spaces. So they're connecting us at so many different scales. So when we're thinking about that in our conservation planning, we are helping to ensure that everyone, no matter what kind of green spaces you live in or have access to, is reaping the benefits from conservation. And so just to highlight a couple of the stories that are excerpted in the State of the Birds report as examples of environmental justice multipliers when it comes to birds. Jose Puente, who lives in California, he told a story about how the flooding issue that his community was experiencing when the levees were placed and those floodplains were restored. Not only did his community not experience the really damaging floods that they had experienced, season after season previously, the birds came back. The birds that required habitats that had healthy hydrology, they came back. They saw flycatchers they hadn't seen in a long time. Birds they hadn't seen in a while return to the places where they live. What a beautiful example, right, of benefits for people and birds. And then Helen Drummond, who is a mentor actually of mine, who's the director of the Houston Audubon, she was talking about greening urban areas and its impact on urban heat island effect. And so if you live in a city or in a place that is in a highly built environment, you may have felt in your own body the difference between how hot it is in the summer when you're surrounded by concrete versus the cool that you feel when you are able to be surrounded by green infrastructure, whether it's forests or it's grasslands. And so greening urban areas with native trees helps to not only restore the habitats of birds and bring birds back that require those kinds of ecosystems, but it also helps improve the health of the community, in particular for communities of color and underserved urban communities. So two really brief but obvious examples about how environmental justice is multiplied through bird conservation. And there are countless, truly countless examples of these kinds of co-benefits when it comes to bird conservation. Now, one really interesting dynamic that I want to point out, which I came to know about through my friend Deja Perkins, who is a PhD student at North Carolina State University. It turns out that environmental injustice, which I'm also by definition here, including the lack of engagement by conservation organizations across the board, whether they're Audubon chapters or they're local nature centers or whatever it might be. The same communities that are kind of bearing the brunt of environmental harm, which again are predominantly Black and brown and indigenous and low wealth, those same communities have tended to not be engaged by a lot of these larger conservation efforts or organizations. And that has actually been identified and it is visible in eBird, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with that community and citizen science platform. So this is a map of Atlanta. This is literally just a screenshot off of my phone. You know how you can go to the Explore page on eBird. This is a screenshot showing where the hotspots are. I live in Southwest Atlanta, down where it says East Point. And so the Northeast section of Atlanta is the wealthiest part of Atlanta, also the whitest part of Atlanta. Southwest Atlanta is the Blackest and brownest part of Atlanta, and also the lowest wealth part of Atlanta. As you can see, those hotspots, those data points are clustered in Northeast Atlanta. But what I can tell you from experience, because I live in Atlanta, is that Southwest Atlanta has hundreds and hundreds of acres of old growth forests. It's actually pretty unique in the way that it's laid out, but you don't see data points there. The lack of data points doesn't mean that there aren't birds. It just means that the people who live there have not been engaged in these community and citizen science platforms the way that folks in Northeast have. And what that does is it creates data holes, right? So we look at this map and you might assume that all the birds are in Northeast, but that's not true. And so when there's environmental injustice kind of manifesting even in the way that data is collected or that citizen science is engaged in our communities, that impacts our ability to know where birds are and to accurately understand or even collect data about birds. And so for that reason, it's important that environmental justice is central to the way that we even do our data collection and scientific research. And so as I mentioned, birds connect our landscapes locally, internationally. And because they can be found along the urban to rural gradient, it's important that we invest along the urban to rural gradient. We shouldn't just, focus all of our resources and our time and our energies on these large, expansive, quote unquote, high quality conservation areas. Birds are stopping over in people's backyards. I've had hummingbirds coming to people's feeders 30 floors up in apartment complexes, right? Birds are everywhere. And so our conservation investments should reflect that. How am I doing on time, Tom?
You have 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. So when it comes to saving birds, right? So we think about all of these dynamics at play. Some birds are in, most birds are in decline. Some birds are rebounding or have increasing populations. We also know that the status quo, as we mentioned at the beginning, isn't working. And it turns out, and as is the case, this is beyond, of course, just bird conservation, but it is also true for bird conservation. Saving birds, successful conservation requires cross-cutting solutions. And when I say cross-cutting solutions, I mean interdisciplinary solutions, solutions that are not siloed. So you're not just thinking about birds by themselves, you're thinking about birds as they relate to where they are, the communities that live where they are, thinking about it in a multidisciplinary way, cross-cutting solutions that are proactive, community-focused, and large-scale. A very integral part to these cross-cutting solutions, and really the backbone oftentimes of these solutions, happens in our political sphere, which in some ways may feel unfortunate given how hard it can be to move legislation through our democracy and through our democratic process, but it really is the backbone to ensuring that resources are made available to act on our priorities. And so some of the key pieces of legislation that are happening right now, so there are so many bills that are upholding the current resources that we have access to for bird conservation. I won't go into those today. What I'm going to go into are bills that are coming down the pipeline, bills that have not been signed into law, that have not passed through Congress at all, or not successfully passed through Congress yet, but that we need in order to make resources available for bird conservation, especially in the context of our changing climate and changing world. And so the first of the two bills that I'm going to highlight here, which you may have heard of, especially last year, the first being Recovering America's Wildlife Act. If this bill is new to you, this is a bill that would massively increase the budget, particularly for state wildlife agencies, to be able to invest resources into the conservation of the species of greatest conservation need in their states, many of which are birds across the nation. And it will also invest in tribal conservation. And this will be the first time that tribal nations would have dedicated annual funding from the federal government for their wildlife conservation. That has never happened before, and it is critical for environmental justice and for the successful conservation of species that happens. And so when it comes to the birds that are imperiled, if you aren't familiar with the terminology of species of greatest conservation need, or SGCN, that's a designation that states give to species that essentially are of exactly that, conservation concern in their state. And across the country, 62 of the 70 tipping point species that we identified in the State of the Birds report are also listed as species of greatest conservation need by state agencies. And Recovering America's Wildlife Act would be money that would be injected directly into state budgets to address the declining wildlife in their states. And so I'm going to encourage you, you will be hearing very soon, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It didn't get passed in the last Congress, but we are in a new Congress, and our legislators in the House and Senate are still energized around this bill. So it will be introduced into the Senate, fingers crossed. And so we encourage you to reach out to your Congress people, your senators and your members or your representatives in the House of Representatives, to urge them to vote yes on and pass Recovering America's Wildlife Act. The second policy that I want to bring up, the second piece of legislation, is called the North American Grasslands Act. And this piece of legislation is particularly important because of the steep decline of grassland birds. As I mentioned earlier, grassland birds saw the steepest declines on average across all the other land bird categories, across all the other habitats. And so we need, again, targeted efforts. It's blanket efforts are good for certain things, but when it comes to declining species, you have to be specific in addressing the specific threats. And so the Grasslands Act would really be working, again, at that public-private interface. So it would help farmers, ranchers, as well as tribes to work together collaboratively, along with public agencies, to work together collaboratively to address the threats that are facing grasslands, to be very specific in those actions to address the threats, to ensure that those birds don't go extinct, right? And one thing that I will add is that these bills, they're for species that aren't listed as species of conservation, or that aren't listed as endangered and threatened yet. They're for species that are. But one of the most important things, and I'll wrap it up here, is to ensure that we are taking a proactive approach to conservation. One of the most important management techniques you can use is to be proactive. And it's hard to do that when you're resource scarce. And so it's important that our conservation is proactive, which allows us to have voluntary involvement of the public in conservation. It's faster, it's most effective. It provides benefits for landowners and communities and businesses, and it helps birds before they need the emergency room treatment of the Endangered Species Act, before they're listed as endangered or threatened. It gets them before they get to that point. It's important, wrapping it up, that the scale that we're working at is both large and small. We're thinking about how birds are moving and utilizing spaces, both at local scales and what those dynamics look like, as well as internationally. And we have, thankfully, legislation that is in place and that will continue to become in place to ensure coordination and resource sharing across the geographies that especially migratory birds use, right? If North America is conserving their birds one way, but there are different things happening in the wintering grounds, that lack of coordination will cause further imperilment of those species. So coordination and engaging communities and protecting the habitats everywhere that birds are found. And this is just a quick screenshot. I'm not going to go through this graphic here, but this is one of the screenshots from the State of the Birds report that highlights some of the specific kinds of actions that would help to benefit birds in a changing world, help them navigate the built environments that they're in, and navigate a changing climate as well. And in closing, you may be familiar with the Emily Dickinson poem, The Thing with Feathers. That poem means a lot to me. And there's a line, that says, hope is the thing with feathers. And oftentimes as a biologist or as a policy advocate, or however you show up in this space, I know I have personally felt discouraged many times thinking about the scale of the problem and what seemed to be the lack of resources to address them. But every time that I'm looking at a bird, studying an individual bird, watching in an individual nest, right? Birds themselves feel like such an impossibility. The way that birds are structured, their morphology, right? The way their bodies are made up. When you think about that compared to what they actually accomplish, how far they can fly, how much they can eat, how long they can fast, right? Like it's unbelievable. To me, birds are an impossibility. I don't know how it's possible that they exist and exist the way that they do. But every time that I see birds and I think about just how magnificent and miraculous they are, I suddenly have hope that it's maybe possible that the thing that seems or feels impossible, the conservation of all these birds that are in decline, the protection of our natural ecosystems, the protection of our communities, feels impossible. But if birds can exist, if birds can thrive, then maybe what feels impossible isn't actually impossible. This is a picture of my friend Isaiah Smith. He's one of the most incredible bird photographers, bird artists. I encourage you to look him up on Instagram and Twitter. He has just a joyous smile and brings so much hope and joy into the field. And so I just wanted to kind of honor him in this last slide here and point out one of the most beautiful poems, I think, in my opinion, when it comes to birds and hope. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And I'd be happy to take any questions that folks might have about the report or more generally. So thank you.
Thank you. That was that was great. We have a whole bunch of questions in the waiting in the chat, which Tom Anderson's going to be asking us.
Sure. Let me start right in. And Patrick, of course, if you have questions, I mean, obviously, if you have things to add, feel free, but also if you have questions, chime in as well. So, Corina, the first couple of questions were in reaction to the video of the fish eating the bird. Bev Probin, who is a member and a great volunteer at our Milford Point Coastal Center, asks, as a researcher, are you allowed to interfere on behalf of the birds to help save them?
That's a great question. So there are contexts in which interference is a strategic management choice, right? So like there are things like, predator exclusion devices, and you can keep certain predators from accessing breeding grounds, right? So that's like a very strategic management choice. I, though, as an individual, never kind of interfere or act on the environment that I'm trying to study or monitor. Because in research, and in my particular research, I'm trying to understand certain like predator-prey dynamics. And if I interfere with that, that can skew the data and create essentially patterns that maybe aren't reflective of what naturally happens or what normally happens in that in that landscape. And so in order to most accurately understand it, I need to do as little as possible to interfere. But I will say that when, that was a video camera footage, and when I watched it, I cried. Like I cried. And I'm not, well, maybe I am a little bit of an emotional person, but like I've seen all kinds of stuff, right? Like working with wildlife for about 10 years now, but I cried. And at the same time, like my jaw was on the floor. I was like texting my advisor, "You are not going to believe what I just saw." I was telling everybody. Like it's an interesting combination of like, wow, hate to see it, hate to see a chick of an imperiled species go out like that. But at the same time, wow, we didn't know that was a dynamic happening where they lived. And now we have better understandings of the multidimensional threat that face seaside sparrows and other birds that live in their ecosystems.
Terrific. So Sylvia Halkin, who is Dr. Sylvia Halkin, she's a professor at Central Connecticut State University, was also impressed by that little video. She says, wow, any idea which species that was that ate the chick from the flooded salt marsh nest?
Yes, so that was actually a great question. Thank you. That was a mummy chog, which is a kind of killifish. And I like to describe it as kind of like the raccoon of fish. Like you can find raccoons almost anywhere, right? It's like they are adapted to a specific ecosystem, but you can find them in salt marshes, you can find them in forests and city, and these fish, like they live in tidal environments, and they will literally survive in like a low oxygen puddle, really, excuse me, like all day until the tide comes back in. They've even sent mummy chogs to outer space and they were fine. So they like of all species to like jump into a nest and try to eat a bird, I'm really not surprised that it was a mummy chog. But they're small, and the chick relative to its size, it's like, why would you even go for it? But they went for it. Yeah. Mummy chogs are fascinating.
Very interesting. So here's a sort of an internal question. Joyce Lights, who's our development director and chief operating officer, wondered, would the seaside sparrow chick have survived the flood otherwise, or are floods impacting their survival as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There are contexts in which chicks can survive floods because that chick had just hatched and had like no feathers. The thermal regulation issue may have killed it, even if the drowning didn't kill it. And so there is always a possibility that it could have survived because it actually was still alive when the fish, pulled it under and was eating it. But usually if a chick can lift its head above the water line, they can survive a high tide that floods their nest. It's hard to say if that particular individual would have survived. I would guess probably not, but you never know.
Okay. So here's a longer question from Patricia Hauser, who is a member of ours, a member of Connecticut Audubon from Milford. She says, is there a study you can recommend that highlights the impact on birds of projects to increase urban tree canopy? Also, fascinating to hear about the synergy between bird habitat restoration and environmental justice. Is the term intersectional environmentalism applied in what you read? Is it a helpful term in your opinion? So that's a lot of questions, but they're all good.
Yeah. So the first question about the study. So I was just at the Wildlife Society conference, and I was talking to a researcher whose research was exactly that. He was studying the impact of urban reforestation, I think in Kentucky, on birds, but it's not published yet. And I can't think of like a study off the top of my head that covers that, but I wish I had more information for you. But essentially I can tell you his preliminary results from, my listening to his poster session, again, unpublished, was that areas that had reforested, and this was like, I think over several decades, areas that had been reforested had a higher diversity of birds, as you might guess, forest birds, and, included owls and so some predators, as well as lots of songbirds. And so there was a clear relationship between the diversity of birds and the establishment of the reforested regions. So then the next question was, can you remind me what the next question was?
Yeah, sure. Let me find it again.
Sorry.
She asks, fascinating to hear about the synergy between bird habitat restoration and environmental justice. Is the term intersectional environmentalism applied in what you read? Is it a helpful term in your opinion?
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. And yes, so I hear, so terms like intersectional environmentalism or integrated environmentalism or integrated conservation, there are a couple of phrases that kind of mean similar or the same things. And I have heard, and I do hear intersectional environmentalism a lot. And there's actually an organization called Intersectional Environmentalists, which I highly recommend you check out. But yeah, so essentially this approach to environmentalism more broadly, or wildlife conservation, with an intersectional or integrated lens, understanding that we cannot possibly problem solve effectively in a silo or without looking at the totality of the variables impacting the situation. And it's interesting because even with, like, from an ecological perspective, we know that we have to account for as many possible variables that could be influencing the state of a thing, right, that we're studying. But for some reason, when it comes to the actual field of biology or ecology, it's only until kind of somewhat recently that, like, looking beyond the field has really been incorporated, right? Like, we know that that's important for, like, within the context of an ecosystem. We are part of an ecosystem. Our field of study is within an ecosystem of fields of studies, right? So we have to be thinking about how the variables that birds, people, like public housing impacts birds, you know what I mean? Like, everything is connected. And so I think that intersectional environmentalism, intersectional conservation is really is an approach that we have to, like, hang on to. Like, we have to demand that is how we approach our problem solving, our research from here on out. Like, we don't have time or the resources for anything else. So yes, I very much appreciate that term and that approach.
Beautiful. So here's a question from Steve Broker, who is from New Haven, longtime friend of Connecticut Audubon. He's written for our Connecticut State of the Birds report. He wonders about your education, and he writes here, the University of Georgia is both historically and in the present day one of the great academic centers for the study of ecology. Would you say something about your academic trajectory?
Sure.
Also, what your professional hopes are for the years ahead?
Trying to get me into an existential crisis on the Zoom. So I went to Georgia Southern University for my master's. So my undergrad degree is in zoo and wildlife biology from Malone University in Ohio. I was a zookeeper for 4 years after that. So animal care was a very big part of my journey, and birds were most of the kind of the species that I took care of were mostly birds. And then I knew I wanted to go into research at some point. So after a few years of being a zookeeper, I went back to school to Georgia Southern, where I studied nest predation, landscape ecology with seaside sparrows. And so that's kind of like my my educational background. And I've worked at Georgia Audubon, and I now work at National Wildlife Federation. And so when it comes to, like, my trajectory, I'm honestly, it has really been a build as you go kind of situation for me. And I'm starting to get a lot more clarity now. Again, it's about this intersectionality and, like, understanding how much is at play. And in my work at National Wildlife Federation, it's the first time that I've had kind of an upfront seat to the policy realm of wildlife conservation and just how much it takes to make even the smallest movements. And then when something passes, right? So when you get the bill, when you get the funds, right? So we've seen last year, a couple bills passed that put, like, make a lot of money available for things like natural infrastructure or climate adaptation or, management of, ecosystem management, habitat management of various kinds. Once that money is made available, there are resources that are required to be able to, like, prioritize where and how you spend the money, right? So there are all these needs at so many steps I wasn't aware of, and needs at every step. And so as I learn more about the full ecosystem of wildlife conservation. I'm kind of, realizing, working kind of at the intersection of maybe policy and biology is of interest to me, but always kind of centering environmental justice and understanding, how can we geographically, so my specific interest is how can we geographically prioritize where we invest conservation resources for connectivity, as well as for to ensure that we are benefiting frontline communities, Black, Brown, and low wealth communities the most when we choose a place to put money and resources. So that's broadly where my interests lie. That could manifest in a whole diversity of actual career titles. So we'll see what happens in the future. But thank you for asking.
Great. So there are a couple more questions, but before I get to them, I'm going to interject some messages of praise. Patricia Hauser says, great message, inspiring, with an exclamation point. Kathy Hagedorn, who is the director of our Deer Pond Farm Preserve in the town of Sherman, says, bravo, capital letters with an exclamation point. Sylvia Halkin, who asked one of the questions earlier, says, Corina, great talk. You are so articulate about such important issues. Thank you for the fish ID too.
Thank you so much.
Mary Pelletier, who is from Hartford and is involved in the Urban Bird Treaty up there, which we are, asks, are you aware or involved in any Fish and Wildlife Service Urban Bird Treaty programs?
So I'm aware of them. I'm actually not involved in any of them, but I'm about to start plugging in. I had the distinct honor of meeting with the Assistant Director of Migratory Bird Program for Fish and Wildlife Service, Jerome Ford, who's a Black man, biologist, brilliant, incredible. And it just opened a whole new world of engagement and understanding and excitement about their work. So after meeting with him, I'm like, oh, I have to connect with this. So I don't know. I've not previously connected with them, but I'm excited to in the very near future.
Terrific. Here's a question about grasslands. James Boyer from Hamden, which is right a little bit north of and contiguous to New Haven. He asks, or he says, grasslands are being reduced by conversion to other uses, including housing developments, but those that exist are also threatened by harvesting before birds like bobolinks have fledged. Is there any legislation that might get private landowners to delay harvesting until these birds fledge?
That's a great question. And honestly, I don't have an answer for you. I'm not that close to the policy to know that level of detail. I suspect the North American Grasslands Act, which I personally will learn more about as it unfolds and its possible introduction to Congress, kind of what the details of that are. I imagine that kind of that specific of a strategy is likely to be a tool in the toolbox of approaches when it comes to, okay, what are the threats and what are the actions to address those threats? And there are a lot of brilliant minds, obviously, at the table with this policy and with this legislation, a lot of indigenous scholars and wildlife managers. And so I would suspect that would certainly be on the table as far as an option, but I personally do not have the knowledge to speak much to that specific question, but thank you for asking.
This is actually a good opportunity, Patrick, to bring you back in, if you don't mind. Patrick, as some people know, is one of the region's experts on grassland birds, and Connecticut Audubon has done some specific outreach to landowners to try to convince them to delay their harvesting, in particular up in our Pomfret region. So I was just wondering, Patrick, if you have anything to add on that topic.
Yeah, it's really an economic question, because delayed mowing reduces the value of the hay. There is a sort of a sweet spot where you can delay up to July 15th, and you'll get most of your bobolinks fledged and still have some decent value to your hay. But to legislate late harvest of the hay would probably cause an undue hardship to a lot of farmers. So, and an uncompensated one. So what we need to do is, look in some countries in Europe, they actually pay farmers to harvest birds. So, and that's part of what the Bobbling Project is looking at, is ways that it can compensate farmers for this delayed value, or the diminished value of the delayed mowing of the grasslands. Once you get into some of the sparrows that have multiple broods, then you're talking August for fledge day, and it gets to be even more economically distressing for the farmer to comply.
Interesting.
And this brings up a really important dynamic because I know very little, almost nothing about this. And so I just learned a whole lot, Patrick. Thank you for sharing that. But it brings up a similar dynamic that I feel like I see pop up or manifest in a variety of contexts, where it's like there might seem like a clear A to B, this is the problem, this is the solution, right? Harvesting at this time would help the birds, so do that. And there is a path, a conservation path, that would cause harm to people, and the same people who are kind of already marginalized economically, socially, whatever it might be. That is an option, and that has been in many cases. Conservation decisions have been made like that, made in ways that kind of further push people into vulnerability economically, environmentally, whatever it might be. And so that intersectionality or that integrated approach to conservation is like critical for ensuring that we don't hurt people in the process of protecting wildlife or birds. And it is very much possible for everyone to thrive, but it takes being purposeful, because you can cause harm in the problem solving if we're not. So I really appreciate the question, and Patrick, for you highlighting that dynamic.
Fantastic. So Corina, can I ask you a couple of questions that are related to Black Birders Week, which, as Patrick mentioned, you were a co-organizer of. The first one is, what's your opinion of the importance of a racially diverse population of birders and conservationists, and how could an organization like Connecticut Audubon, which we're in a state with big urban areas like Bridgeport, New Haven, and Hartford, how could we do better in that area?
Yeah, so I think back to that map that I showed you of Atlanta and where the birders are, right? And when I say birders, I do mean a very specific thing. I'm not talking about people who like birds, because people across demographics and geographies love birds, right? But when it comes to who's actually plugged into the conservation of birds, like who's plugged into sharing data and things like that, we see exactly what happens when you have an all-white birding demographic. When it comes to eBird use, you have holes in your data, you have holes in your understanding about how birds move, where they are, where the ecosystems they depend on are, right? And so those are kind of very tangible impacts on the science. And then, of course, when it comes to just like being creative and problem solving, and I say this all the time, the same way that we know as ecologists or biologists or just fans of nature that like diversity is the substance of good problem solving, whether you're talking about your genes, and having diverse genetic diversity, or you're talking about like an ecosystem. We know that diversity allows you to problem solve and find the solution to whatever is presented to you. And so the more diverse perspectives and people and thinkers and backgrounds you have making decisions, thinking about solutions, the more likely you are to come to the most effective solutions and equitable solutions, which are also the most effective solutions. And so without knowing very much about Connecticut Audubon's, makeup or like community relationships, I would say that I always, even as like a Black person, I know that I can't just show up in a neighborhood I'm not from and expect people to like follow me or do what I, to like follow my lead in any way. And I would never want that to be the case. And so I always, diversifying any space or bringing in communities or people who are not presently represented requires one-on-one relationships and interpersonal trust building. It's not at like an institution level, right? Institutions are just made up of people, humans. And so it has to be a human to human trust building, relationship building. And that might mean, if there are community meetings that happen, so for example, in Atlanta, we have neighborhood planning units that are small kind of neighborhood blocks that meet and talk about their neighborhoods and what they want to do. It's showing up, being quiet, listening, building relationships with individuals, right? And then through that, you're not the one showing up at a community group or meeting or something and saying, hey, I mean, you might, but hey, come to Connecticut Audubon Society meeting, right? Like instead you can have the people who are the leaders and the participants and the members of those communities kind of directing your interaction with their community, but also being the messenger to the community and having that trust built and that buy-in from them. And so that's always what I recommend. It's never as complicated as I feel like people maybe imagine it to be. The same way that we build trust with people like us is the same way we have to build trust with people who aren't like us. We have to take time, we have to sit down, we have to speak, we have to listen. And that's really what it comes down to, where the rubber meets the road. So I think that responsibility falls on every individual. It's not like the president or the chair of this committee or whomever. It's every individual who makes up Connecticut Audubon has to kind of take that on as their own value. So that would be my recommendation.
Great. Okay. So then probably the last thing, because we're at 4 minutes before 8, remind us of the reasons you helped organize Black Birders Week in May, maybe June of 2020, and bring us up to date with where it is now in meeting the goals that it set. So first tell us what those goals were and where we are now.
Yeah, so Black Birders Week really existed to, number one, kind of highlight and demonstrate the fact that, the kind of what have been treated as isolated incidents that a lot of Black people experience in their enjoyment or recreation in the outdoors, like racist experiences, are actually part of a systemic issue and not just kind of these one-off situations. And that's why it was kind of catalyzed by Christian Cooper's experience in Central Park. So it's to highlight that reality is pervasive among Black people, that Black people's experiences. And it was to, even more than that, connect Black people who are birders and like build a network of people, Black people who love spending time outside. And that to me was like the most life-changing element of it. Over the course of like a year, I went from knowing 1.5 Black birders, and by half, I mean like they kind of like birds. Okay, like to having a network of literally hundreds and hundreds of Black people who love birds. Like, and these are my friends, these are my mentors now. Like it changed my life, honestly. And then of course, to celebrate the diversity of birds, the same way that birding is literally a celebration of diversity. And so the environments and the people who we are with and, our societies and our groups and, they should reflect that value of diversity. And oftentimes, typically they don't. And so it was to kind of highlight those dynamics. And I have to say that over the past, I guess, this will be the 4th one coming up now, I believe. Like I said, I never could have imagined that there were this many Black people who loved what I loved. And the fact that I didn't know that was just a function of the systemic issue that we always talk about, right? Like access to the professional field, access to the education, all of that. And so now I feel so much more empowered to kind of follow my calling and the things that I'm passionate about. And I know so much more. I have such a richer understanding of the world because I'm surrounded by Black and brown birders. And so I just am thankful. They're my best friends now. Like the people I met through that are my best friends now, lifelong friends. And so I'm just grateful for the network and the opportunities it's created, and hope that it will continue in perpetuity to create more opportunities and more connections for more people into the future.
That's terrific. Thank you very much. I'm glad we got a chance to address that and to hear what you had to say about it. So it's just about 8 o'clock. I'm going to turn it back to Patrick for some closing remarks, and he'll do the thank yous.
Well, thank you, Tom. That was really excellent. We're just about out of time. It's been a really interesting and important presentation and discussion. Corina, thank you so much. We could not have hope for a better opening presentation for this year's series as part of the kickoff to our 125th anniversary year. I also want to thank all of you. You said your donation this year to Young Gifted and Wild Birds goes directly to our sanctuaries and management of our sanctuaries and their habitats. Many of you have already subscribed to all 5 presentations. The next is February 2nd with Joanna Wu from UCLA. We'll see you all there. Thank you so much.